Hi, I'm Andrew Connell, and I'm a Microsoft MVP in the area of Microsoft 365 development. And I have a lot of experience with SharePoint development, including all of the different development models that we've had, Microsoft Graph development, Microsoft Teams development, and developing add-ins for Microsoft Office, as well as working with Microsoft Identity, including Azure AD. Users are at the core of most operations in Microsoft 365. Microsoft Graph enables developers full control over the lifecycle of users in Microsoft 365, including creating, updating, and deleting users, in addition to listing users within the organization. In this section, you're going to learn how to use Microsoft Graph to work with users in Microsoft 365, including the required permissions. In this first section, we're going to primarily look at accessing users. Microsoft's Office 365 developer vision focuses on the user's experience and their data. As a developer, you can bring your applications into their user experience. With over 1.2 billion users of Office worldwide, this is a huge opportunity to provide a window into your applications, as well as being able to connect into their data and add intelligence to your applications. There are currently 850 million events created a month and a total of 470 petabytes of data or more in the service that can add value for your users. Microsoft Graph is the gateway to your data in the Microsoft Cloud, as you can see from the list of resources, services, and entities on this slide. There are lots of things that you can take advantage of in the Office 365 platform. You can work with mail, calendar, contacts, tasks, in addition to content inside of SharePoint sites and lists, files inside of OneDrive, and interact with Microsoft Teams and many more things that you can take advantage of. Each of these services typically has its own API that you can leverage to read and write to these different services. However, it can be challenging and cumbersome to work with these different services, as each has implemented their own endpoint, permission model, and syntax for performing some operations like searching and other subtleties. Each endpoint is also secured with Azure AD, which means that developers will need to authenticate with Azure AD and obtain an OAuth access token for each service they want to work with. The Microsoft Graph addresses many of these challenges by acting as a proxy to a lot of the different services. It encompasses data residing in Office 365, such as mail, calendar, and contacts, and OneDrive, as well as many others. In addition, it also provides access to Windows 10 and enterprise mobility and security under a single endpoint. This endpoint, https://graph.microsoft.com, allows developers to create applications that will only have to authenticate once and obtain a single access token that can be used to retrieve data from multiple sources, greatly simplifying the development process. Each service will still have their individual permissions or scopes, but all of these permissions are defined in a single place under the Microsoft Graph endpoint and handles the underlying calls and permission requests to each of these different endpoints. As the previous slide stated, the Microsoft Graph is your gateway to all data in Microsoft 365. It is a single resource that proxies multiple Microsoft services. Because the Microsoft Graph acts as a proxy endpoint to multiple endpoints for each Microsoft 365 service, it will simplify the process of obtaining OAuth access tokens that you must include with each request to one of these endpoints. Unlike the process of obtaining a different token for each endpoint, the Microsoft Graph enables you to obtain a single access token to submit requests that can retrieve data from all the services and endpoints that the Microsoft Graph exposes. One of the challenges we used to have to deal with these different services was determining the endpoint URL for each service, as some of them were unique to each user. To address this, Microsoft created a directory service that you could query to determine what the URL was for the different services for a particular user. However, the Microsoft Graph greatly simplified this with two special endpoints, the /me and the /myorganization endpoints. These will take you to the root of your user entity or your organization within the Microsoft Graph. This module will explain how you can easily find relationships between entities in the Microsoft Graph and traverse these objects to find related content. Using the /me and the /myorganization endpoints in combination with the ability to traverse related entities, the Microsoft Graph makes it easy to access your data. Developers can create all sorts of applications that will communicate with the Microsoft Graph. And to support as many developers and as many platforms as possible, the Microsoft Graph has two options for developers to choose from when integrating the Microsoft Graph into their applications. At its core, Microsoft Graph is a REST API. This means that developers can use any platform, any framework, and any programming language they are most comfortable with. The only requirement is that they issue a common HTTP request and process HTTP responses, which pretty much all relevant platforms and frameworks and languages can do these days. In addition, Microsoft Graph also provides native SDKs for developers who want to leverage a rich programming model with their applications. These SDKs are available for multiple platforms and simplify the process of interacting with the Microsoft Graph REST API, abstracting away the tasks of constructing, submitting, and processing the REST requests and responses with Microsoft Graph APIs. You will likely find an existing SDK for the platform and language that you are working on, as you'll find almost all of the popular platforms are covered, including .NET, iOS, Android, Java, PHP, Ruby, JavaScript, and many, many more. Microsoft Graph supports two styles of authentication. One supports the users to authenticate using either Azure AD accounts, which are also known as work and school accounts, or a Microsoft account. The former account is typically used to access content and resources within other Office 365 services and Microsoft 365. The latter account type, a Microsoft account, is used to access consumer services such as OneDrive Consumer, Outlook.com, and other related services. Now, what's nice about Microsoft Graph supporting both styles of authentication is that the same API and the same endpoints can be used to create applications that will expose business data to Microsoft in Microsoft 365 or consumer data within the Microsoft Consumer Services. This makes it easy for developers to learn a single API and have the ability to configure their application to support both businesses and consumer data that is driven strictly by the user and what type of account they're going to log in with. Users are the representation of an Azure AD work and school account or Microsoft account in the Microsoft Graph. The user resource in Microsoft Graph is a hub from which you can access the relationships and resources that are relevant to your users. You can use Microsoft Graph to access the relationships, documents, contacts, and preferences that are contextually relevant to the signed-in user. And the user resource provides a straightforward way for you to access and manipulate user resources without having to perform additional calls, look up specific authentication information, and directly issue queries against other Microsoft Graph resources. What can you do with the Microsoft Graph user resource? Well, the user resource is the gateway to resources related to a user, and it can be the currently signed in user or another user if your identity and application has been granted the necessary permissions to access those other users. What kinds of things can you do with the Microsoft Graph user resource? You can manage your organization, you can create new users in your organization, or update the resources and relationships for existing users. You can use the Microsoft Graph to do the following user management tasks. You can create or delete users in your Azure AD organization. You can list a user's group memberships and determine whether a user is a member of a group. You can list the users who report to a user and assign managers to users. And you can upload or retrieve a photo for the user. You can also work with calendars and tasks. You can view, query, and update user calendar and calendar groups associated with the user, including listing calendar events and creating events on a user's calendar. You can view tasks assigned to a user, find free meeting times for a set of users, and get a list of reminders set on a user's calendar. You can also administer mail and handle contacts. You can configure user settings for contact lists and send mail on behalf of a user, including listing email messages and send new mail, create and list user contacts and organize contacts in folders, receive and update mailbox folders and settings. And you can also enrich your apps with user insights and maximize the relevance in your application by promoting recently used or trending documents and contacts associated with a user. You can use Microsoft Graph to return documents recently viewed and modified by a user, return documents and sites trending around a user's activity, list documents shared with a user through email or OneDrive for Business, as well. Now, let's explore the Microsoft Graph user resource endpoint. There are two ways you can access users through the Microsoft Graph. You can access a signed-in user through the me alias at microsoftgraph.com/v1.0/users. For a specific user, you can access it. So back up. I just jumped the slide on accident, so delete that. The /me endpoint is going to map to the same endpoint if you went to users / with the user ID or their user principal name. You can access a specific user using either their ID or their user principal name. For example, you can have it say user / user ID or users / user principal name. Developers can also use one of the many Microsoft Graph .NET SDKs or one of the other native SDKs to obtain a user object. Developers can use one of the many Microsoft Graph .NET SDKs to obtain a user. And for example, to get a user with a Microsoft Graph .NET SDK, you would use some of the following code. So you're first obtaining a Microsoft Graph service client. And then here you can see where I've got a client.me.request and getting the end result for the user. And then I can access all the values on that user for that specific user. Or I can request a specific user by going to the user's collection and passing in the ID of the user as a parameter in the array. And that would give me back a single user back. In order to perform user operations, you're going to need one of the following permissions. The specific permission required will depend on the operation that you want to perform. For example, if you are creating, editing, or deleting a user, one of the write permissions is definitely going to be required. And some permissions can be granted by a user, while others must be granted to the app by an administrator. Delegated permissions granted by users include things like user.readbasic.all, user read, and user read write. While application permissions that are granted by admins include many more permissions, as you see here on the slide. Now, each resource has an additional referenced resources, such as their email messages. You could go to get all the emails for a specific user by going to the user endpoint /messages, or get all of their calendar events by going to /events, or by getting a user's OneDrive consumer or OneDrive for business contents by going to the /drive endpoint. In this demo, we're going to create an Azure AD application using the Azure Active Directory Admin Center, and we're going to look at a .NET Core console application that's going to query the Microsoft Graph for user data, and we're going to use the Microsoft Graph .NET SDK. Now, the first step we need is an Azure AD application, so let's go create that first. So I'm going to come over to my Azure AD Administrative Center or Admin Center. And I'm going to go create a new app registration. So I go to app registrations and create a new registration. And I'm going to call this application the Microsoft Graph Console app. And it's going to be a single tenant application. So I'll go ahead and select register. Now, once I've done that, you'll see here that we have an application ID and a directory ID as well. We're going to need those in our app in a minute, but we're going to wait for just a minute to go through and grab those and go update our app. Let's first go over to our authentication tab. Now, the console app that we're creating, we really in this module just want to focus on the Microsoft Graph. I don't want to dwell too deep in the authentication aspects to our application. And the reason for that is because it really gets quite complicated pretty quick on the different options that you have. So I'm trying to keep the authentication as simple and as straightforward as possible. What we're doing, we're using a console app, and this console app is what you call a public client. And what that means is that there's no like app ID and secret. There's an app ID, but there's no secret that we're going to define. And furthermore, we're going to ask the users to log in by providing the console app their credentials, and then we're going to log in on their behalf. That's called the resource owner password credential, and it may not be the best option for a production app. There are other options like device code flow that you can use, and I encourage you to check those out for true production apps. But this is just a demo. We want to focus on the Microsoft Graph aspect, not so much on the authentication aspects. So in the we're going to use the Microsoft Authentication Library, MSAL. and we're going to use that to authenticate and handle some of the authentication stuff for us. So one of the things you do when we have that is that because it's a public client, like a desktop app or a console app, you have special redirect URIs that you use. You don't use like URLs. So here I'm going to check off the one that MSAL is going to use, and that's going to go with the ID of my app. And then furthermore, a little bit farther down, I'm also going to specify that I want to turn on this default client type to treat it as a public client. This by default is turned off, but I'm going to turn this on in this case. So I'll go ahead and save my changes. And the next thing we'll do is we'll go into the API permissions to grant our app the necessary permissions. Now, I could define permissions dynamically, but again, this is a console app, and our user does not have a clean way of granting consent when they just pass their username and password in on a console. So we're going to do that here. So we're going to first add a permission, and what we're going to do is we want to display a bunch of users from our organization. So I'm going to select the Microsoft Graph, and I'm going to add a delegated permission, and that permission is going to be user.read.all. So this allows me to read all the users' full profiles. So I'll go ahead and select that, and then I'll say add permissions. Okay, now this is this permission requires administrative consent. So what I need to do is I need to trigger the admin consent endpoint from the admin console to grant consent for all users in our organization. This may not be what you want to do in your production example. Again, I'm just trying to keep the authentication stuff as simple as possible to focus on Microsoft Graph. All right, here we can see that our permissions have now all been granted, so we're in good shape. So now let's go back over to our console app. Now, before we do that, our console app, we need to tell it the Azure AD tenant and the client ID of our application. So let me go grab the directory ID, and I'm going to go over here to my console app, and in the app settings file, I'm going to go ahead and add in these two values. So we'll add that one, and then we'll grab the application ID, and I'll paste that in right here as well. So there we go. We got both of these now are all set up. So now the next thing I want to do is let's come over here to our console app, and let's take a look and see how this works. All right. So what this does is I first am going to go fetch those app settings. So all that does is just grabs the values from the app settings.json file. And then I'm going to prompt the user to provide their username and password to go authenticate. And then once I've obtained their username and password, I then need to create an instance of an authenticated Microsoft Graph service client. And that's an object that's going to come from the Microsoft Graph.net SDK. So I'm passing in the configuration information, which is our Azure AD app and our Azure AD tenant, and then the username and the password of the user. So let's see how I'm obtaining this. So just real briefly, what we're doing is we ultimately want to create an instance of this Graph service client. And what we have to pass into it is a authentication provider, and that is an MSAL or Microsoft Authentication Library object. So you can see up on line 62, we're going to create an instance of this authentication provider. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to go obtain the ID and the authority from the app settings file. And I'm generating the authority on the fly using the specific directory ID. The next thing I'm doing is I'm creating a collection of all the permissions that we're going to request. And then I'm going to create an instance of the public client application, which is what we use when we're doing a console app. So I'm doing that, creating an instance of that using the client ID and the authority I just generated. And then I'm going to go obtain an instance of an MSAL authentication provider. And that's what this authentication provider is. Now, this code right here is just a little helper class that you see over here. And what this does is it's implementing just a singleton. So I have this get instance, and it's going to create a new instance of this authentication provider. I don't want to have multiple ones that could potentially be storing username and passwords. So instead, I've just created this as a singleton. So there's only one in our console app. And I'm using the public client app that we just generated that you saw a moment ago, the permissions and the credentials for the current user. And in doing that, You see where I've defined all these things. They're all private properties in here. But what it does is that there is a method that when it calls get token async, what this thing is going to do is this is just making sure that eventually it's adding in the access token to the request header as an authorization header. And you can see here where I'm first trying to authenticate using the acquire token silently. And if that doesn't work, we're going to go fetch the token using it by username and password. So now that I have my the authorization provider, or where are we? We're down here in the Graph client. So we've got our Graph client. So let's see how we're actually using that. So now that we have a .NET instance of the Microsoft Graph client, to get a list of all of our users, well, it's pretty straightforward. I'm just going to say graph client.users.request, and then I'm going to add on get async.result. And then I'm going to write out all the results of all the users. And I broke this up into two different calls here. So the request object, you could see what the underlying endpoint was that we were calling from the Microsoft Graph. So I'll save those changes. Let's come over to the console and let's do a .NET build and a .NET run. And I'm going to authenticate using our administrator. So I'll put my username in as the admin, and then I'll put the password in. And here we get a list of all of our users inside of our directory. And you can see here that I'm doing that by just fetching the /users endpoint for the Microsoft Graph. So that's one demo. Now the next thing I want to show you is there's another thing that we can do. So let's go ahead and let me comment all this out. We can also get a specific user, or in this case here, let's get information about the currently signed in user. So we won't log in as the administrator this time, we'll log in as somebody else. But you can see the way that we do that is with this special me endpoint. And then I can write out all the information about me. So let's save our changes and let's run this as well. So this time we will log in as Megan. So we'll do Megan B, and then we'll also grab her password and paste that in. There we go. So we got Megan B, and we've got Megan's password passed in as well. And we can see that we're getting information back about the currently signed in user, which is Megan. And you can see here that I'm getting that by just passing in the /me endpoint. Furthermore, another thing that we can do with this is I can get information about a specific user. So in this case here, we're not getting information about Megan. I want to get information about a very particular user. And so in this case here, I fetched an object ID of a user in our organization. And so you can see here that the first thing I'm doing is I'm going to go grab the user by their ID that you see like this. That's one way of doing it. Or I could have fetched them like this as well, but I pass in the ID of them listed like this. So I don't need to use this first part. Let's use the second part. I think this part of the API is a little bit easier. So we're going to the client, going to the users collection, and passing in the GUID of the individual user. And that's going to give me back this specific user, and then I can go write out the results for this. So let's go make sure we have a real user here. Let's go to our users in Azure, the Azure AD Admin Center, and let's find a user let's grab Alex. So I'll grab Alex, let's grab his object ID, and we'll just paste that in right here. Save our changes, and now let's run this. So this time we'll do another .NET build. Paste in the username, paste in the password, and ta-da, we got Alex's information. You can see the way we're doing that is because we're passing in this /user ID as part of the endpoint. And just to show you, there's another way you can do this. You can use the $filter to filter your request. So again, let's change the value that we're going to be grabbing. Let's change the way we're getting it. So we want it like this, like that. And let's go we want actually this one to run and like that. So when we requested just a single user, this came back for a very specific user. And notice that when we did that, we were able just to get a single result back. But when we do this filter, this is going to give me back a collection. And so notice I'm grabbing the first item back from that collection. So if I save my changes here and I run this, what you'll see is a slightly different request that's going to be generated for the Graph API. So notice here, instead of using the users slash and the GUID, it's adding in a $filter ID equals and then this value right here. So that's another way to get a specific user. So in this demo, what you saw was a couple different ways of getting all users or a specific user or the current user using the me endpoint using the Microsoft Graph .NET SDK, but you also saw the equivalent Microsoft Graph API endpoint as well. In this section, we're going to learn how to get a reference to and download a user's profile photo, as well as access the user's manager. We're also going to see how to save the file, the photo file, locally to your machine. Now, profile photos can be set on a user account or on a group or on a contact in Office 365. And developers can use the Microsoft Graph to view, download, and manage profile photos for these three different resource types. Now, profile photos are stored as a binary data that developers can convert to different formats for use in different use cases. For example, you could convert it to a base64 for use in a web environment. Now, the way that you're going to get a resource's profile photo is if you're using the Microsoft Graph API, you go to the /photo $value endpoint on the resource. So for example, for the currently signed in user's profile photo, you can access it by going to graph.microsoft.com/v1.0/me/photo/$value. You can do the same thing though, the same operation using the Microsoft Graph .NET SDK by just going to the me.photo endpoint or API. Now that's just going to give you access to the actual photo itself, not the binary data for the photo. Now, certain photo sizes can be requested using Microsoft Graph. The supported sizes of HD photos on Office 365 are the following, as you see there on the screen in the slide. Now, you can get the metadata of the largest available photo or specify a size to get the metadata for that specific photo size. If the size that you request isn't available, you can still get a smaller size that the user has uploaded and made available. Now, for example, let's say the user uploads a photo that is 504 by 504 pixels in size, but all but the 600, in this case, all except for the 648 by 648 size of the photo is going to be available for download. Or in the case you see there on the slide, a 550 by 550 is available in all sizes except for one that's bigger. Now, to get a specific photo size, you can use the actual resolution of the photo in the URL as you see there on the slide. So you could say me/photos/48 by 48 $value to get the smaller size of the photo. Now, when you use the photo/$value endpoint to get the binary data for a photo, you're going to need to convert the data into a base64 string, for example, to add it to an email attachment. You can also save the binary stream to the local disk, and if you want to save it as an image. So that's just one of the ways that you can end up doing this. Now, the following code that you see here is going to use the .NET SDK for Microsoft Graph to request a profile photo from the current signed-in user and save it to the disk as a JPEG file. So you see here we're getting the photo by going to me.photo.content, and that's how we're getting the actual data value and the binary content of the photo. I'm then going to create a file locally on my machine, and then I'm going to save the file from the Microsoft Graph to the local file using a file stream. Now, each user resource has an additional referenced resources, such as their email messages at /messages, their /events, and even for files, you can go to /drive. And we talked a little bit about that in the previous section. Now, one of the resources that's linked off of the user resource is the user's manager. The manager property on a user resource is returned as a directory object type. And if you're using one of the native Microsoft Graph SDKs, it should automatically convert the type to a user object, but if not, you can always cast it as a user object because you can expect that's what you're getting back. So here's the Microsoft Graph .NET SDK equivalent to that. So you can see here I'm getting a specific user by their ID, and then I'm going to get their manager object. And when I get their manager object, notice that I'm casting it as a user because that manager object is really a directory object. So here I'm actually writing out the user ID, the manager's ID, the manager's display name, and their email address. And you'll see that because we're going to do this in the demo. In this demo, we're going to use the existing Azure AD app that we created in the previous demo and the existing .NET Core console application to call the Microsoft Graph. And we're going to show you how to do two things. First, how do you get access to the profile photo for the current user? And then also, how can we get some information about, say, the related user? So like, say, the current user's manager. So what I'm going to do here, we have the same console app, and I've got everything set up the exact same way, but I've changed the code a little bit. And the code that we've changed is right down here, right after we get the Microsoft Graph service client. What I want to show you here is how do we get access to the profile photo. I'm going to show you how not only to get the photo, but then also how to download the photo and save it locally. So what I'm going to do first is let's get a reference to the profile photo. So I'm going to do that by just going to the current user, so client.me, and then go to the .photo endpoint. Now, once I've done that, let's write out some information about the photo. So I've got the ID of the photo, I've got something called the media content type, as well as the E tag, just some details about the photo itself. And you can see what the resulting endpoint is that'll be generated. Now, once that's done, let's go get the photo itself. Now, to get the physical photo, this is just a reference to the photo. But if I want some information about the specific photo itself, or like go get the actual data, so like the binary data, I use the .content endpoint here. So I've got the content endpoint, and what I want to do is I want to download the data from the photo, and I want to save it locally into a file. So here I've got the current photo path I'm going to define. So I'm going to do that by going to the current directory, and I'm going to create a brand new file here called profile photo, whatever the ID is of the photo.jpg. I'm going to create the photo right here. So I've got my photo path. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the results that we got back from getting the actual content. I'm going to go to the very beginning of the file, of the stream, and I'm going to copy out all the data from the stream to the photo file that we just created. So once I've done that, I'll show you. I say I've saved the photo, and then we'll see what the results look like. So this time I'm going to go ahead and open this up because you're going to see the photo show up over here on the left. So let's go over here and let's do a .NET build and a .NET run. And let's log in as Adele V, and I will use the same password. So there we go. We got some information about the photo. So we can see it's a JPEG. There's the E tag for it. The photo itself is the 200 by 240 pixel image. And then I've saved the photo down here that you can see locally on my machine. So first I got photo information by going to /photo, and then basically did the same thing, but I got the content endpoint this time. And if I look at the photo, we will see, there we go. There's the photo of the person that just signed in. And I can even go grab another photo. So let's delete this photo and let's try it for a different user just to show that we're not, that we're actually getting a real photo. So let's go back and let's run this again. That was Adele. Let's go to Megan B, and then we'll use the password for Megan. And we got our photo again. And there we go. We have a totally different photo for this person. So here what you've been able to see is how to get the photos. Now let's go do one more thing. Let's look a little bit farther down, and let's now get information about the current user's manager. And so first we have to make sure that a manager is actually specified for our user. So let's go over and let's find a user. So let's take, let's see, we got Alex. We'll use Alex. We'll sign as Alex, and Alex does have a manager. So there we go. Miriam Graham. So copy his ID. Let's come back over to the console and let's paste in their user. So here we're going to the user's endpoint for that specific user, and then I'm going to the manager expanded property and getting that value out. So I'm going to write out the current user, I'm going to write out the manager and the manager's display name. Now notice the manager that comes back, that's a directory object that comes back, right? So the result that I get back from this is going to be a directory object. What I'm going to do is I know that this is a user, so I'm going to cast the directory object as a user and then grab the display name. You probably want to be a little bit more careful with this in production, in a real app, and make sure that you're not casting it to something that doesn't exist. So in this case here, I do know that it works. So now let's go ahead and run our app, and we'll log in as the same, what did I say, Alex? Is that who we're using? Alex. So Alex W is a sign in. So we use Alex W. Oh, there's 2 ampersands in there. That's not what we want. There we go. And then let's grab password. And oh, looks like we downloaded Alex's photo as well. Here we go. So there's Alex. There's Alex's manager. And sure enough, there's Miriam Graham. And you can see that it even got Miriam Graham's email as well, grabbing her display name and her email address. And you can see with the request that we made. So we went straight to the user's endpoint, got it for that specific user, and then I added on the manager at the very end. So pretty cool, makes it nice and easy. So in this demo, you saw how to get access to the current user or a user's photo, download and save that file locally, and then you also saw how to get one of the navigation properties of related entities from the current user, and specifically, we got the current user's manager. Now in this section, we're going to learn how to modify users using Microsoft Graph, and specifically, we're going to see how to create, update, and delete users, and the permissions that are required to do these different operations. So the Microsoft Graph has support for creating, updating, and deleting users within your organization. Now when you're creating or updating a user, the HTTP request body is going to contain the user to create or update. This is typically submitted as a JSON object as a string form. And when creating a user, you must specify some required properties for that user at a bare minimum. You can optionally specify any other writable properties when you create the user. Now to create a user, you're going to submit a request to the user's endpoint as an HTTP post with the request header content type that you're going to set that to application/JSON. In the body of the request, it should include a JSON object in the string format with the following required properties that you see here. The account enabled Boolean property, display name, mail nickname, a password profile object, and the user profile name. So here's what it looks like if you're using the Microsoft Graph API endpoint to do this. Notice we're issuing an HTTP post to the user's collection, and we're using the content type application/JSON. And this is how I would do it if I was using the Microsoft Graph .NET SDK. So I'm getting an instance of the Graph Service Client, I'm creating a new user object, and then we're going to create the user by going to the user's collection and then passing in an add async and passing the user into it. Now you can also update an existing user with Microsoft Graph. That's very similar to creating a new user. There are some subtle differences though. First, the request header should be sent as an HTTP patch instead of a post. And the reason for that is because if you use a post, it's going to update everything, but everything that you leave off is going to be nulled out. Second, the request should be submitted to the endpoint of the user resource to update, not the general/users endpoint. And you need to include a JSON object that is sent as a string in the body of the request, because should include all the properties that you need to update, just like if you were doing a create operation. So if I was doing this with the .NET SDK, you can see here we're doing a similar thing. I'm creating a user object, but the difference is I'm getting a reference to a specific user, in this case, me, and then I'm submitting the new user object that I want to patch using the update async method. Now to delete an existing user, it's similar to updating, except you're not sending a payload, and the request should be an HTTP delete. So here you can see both the API version using the Microsoft Graph API. You just issue an HTTP delete to the endpoint with the content type equal to application/JSON, which that's really not necessary because you're not really submitting anything. And then the last part is the .NET SDK. And here I'm getting a reference to a specific user and calling delete async. This is the user graph, Microsoft Graph users module lab number or demo number 3. Now in this demo, you're going to modify an existing Azure AD app registration using the Azure Active Directory Admin Center. And we're going to use our existing ASP.NET, or sorry, .NET Core console application to use the Microsoft Graph to create, update, and delete users within our organization. Now, in order to do this, the first thing we're going to need to do is we need to go modify our Azure AD application that we've been using. And I need to go add a new permission to it because we only have been reading stuff. We have not been writing anything. So we're going to have to go to our API permissions and we're going to add a new permission. And this permission is going to be the users or user.read_write.all permission. There we go. So now we can write full permissions. So I'll say that. And now the next thing I do, we have to go in and grant access to this just like we have for the other demos. So I'll open up the admin consent endpoint and we'll accept it. And we'll wait for it to grant that permission. Here we can see that the permission has now been granted. So now let's come back over to our .NET console app. And if I look at the program.cs file, so this is just like what we've seen from our previous demos, but notice here that we have our user.readWrite.all permission that we've specified. And I'm going to go make one more change to this, just because that will speed things up. Otherwise, this is a watch setting, and we're not going to change our configuration, so that'll just speed it up a little bit. All right, so let's take a look at this. So what are we doing? So all the code is basically the same as our previous demos. So the first thing we're going to do is let's comment out all of this, which is updating a user, and let's go create a brand new user. So how is that going to work? So after we have a authenticated version of the Microsoft Graph Service Client, I'm then going to pass in the configuration, which has our app ID and app ID and tenant ID, and the username and password of the current user. And then I'm going to call in create user async and pass in our Graph client. So where is that? So create user async is right here. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a new user, and our new user is going to be named Melissa Darrow, right? And so there's Melissa Darrow. And we're going to specify her email address. We have a nickname for her for a mail that's kind of like the alias, the first part of her email. Have to specify her password, so we're just going to make something very simple. And then I'm going to go get to the user's endpoint and call add async on that user's endpoint to go create that user. So what that'll do is then it'll pass back an asynchronous task that we will wait for it to finish and then write out the new user's ID. So let's see this in action. So I'm going to come over to my console. I'll do a .NET build and a .NET run. But before we do that, let's come over here to our users list and let's make sure we don't have a user named Melissa Darrow. So let's do a search for Melissa. And we see we have no users named Melissa. All right, so let's come back over to our console and let's run the app. We're going to log in as an administrator. Pass in the administrator, pass in the password. There we go. So new user was created. Okay, now let's come back over here and let's now do a search. So I'm just going to do a hard refresh the page to make sure there's no caching involved. And let's do a search for Melissa. And there we go. There's our new user of Melissa Darrow. Yeah, it's kind of cool. So we got our new user that's all been set up. Got her name's been set up. Her password's been set, her email's been set as well. So everything's in pretty good shape. So now let's go back and let's look at our code. And the next thing that we're going to want to do is let's go modify the user. So what we're going to do is let's go modify our user. And the way we're going to do that is I'm first going to find Melissa. So let's just say I didn't know what her ID was. I'm going to go to the user's endpoint. I just want her ID, and I'm going to find it by doing a filter on her UPN. And go find that user. That's going to give me a collection of users back, but I know there's only one there. So what I'm then going to do is I'm then going to go update her phone number. So the way I'm going to do that is passing in the Graph client and her ID. So if I come back over here to this app or this method, I'm going to change her mobile phone number to the universal test number. So 555-555-1212. And just to be sure, let's go over and look and make sure we do not have a mobile number set for her. So sure enough, we don't have a mobile number set for her just yet. So if I come back over to my console app, and let's go run this. Before we run this, we actually need to save our changes. There we go. So now everything's saved. Now we can run it. Now something is actually going to happen. And we'll paste in the password. There we go. So now the user's been updated. So let's go double check on that. So let's go back over here to a list of all of our users. We will find Melissa Darrow, and this can take a minute for the data to show up, but it showed up right away. So there we go. We have updated her phone number to 555-555-1212. Fantastic. Now, what you saw then in this demo, let's see, was there one more? I want to show you one more thing, and that is how do you delete a user? So let's delete a user, and we're going to use the same Melissa. So we're going to get our user, as we saw earlier, and then I'm going to delete her by calling delete user async. And to delete a user, that's very simple. You're just going to get a reference to your user, and instead of calling update async, I'm going to call delete user or delete async after I fetch the specific user. So let's see this. So come back over here to the console. We will run this again. .NET run. I will pass in the username and the password. There we go. So Melissa should be deleted. Let's go back to all of our users. And we'll do a search for Melissa. And no Melissa has been found. Melissa's been deleted. So there, you saw the entire life cycle of a user in this demo. How to create a user, how to modify an existing user, and also how to delete a user using the Microsoft Graph.NET SDK. But you can do all the same stuff using the Microsoft Graph API, the raw REST API as well. So thank you for taking the time to watch this module. In this module, we talked about working with the users collection with Microsoft Graph, both from accessing users, accessing the profile photos, related information such as the manager, and then finally how to modify, create, and delete existing users. I hope you got a lot out of this module and learned a lot about working with the Microsoft Graph.